The newsroom screens were still refreshing when the alert flashed across every major political desk in North America. 5 minutes ago, that was all it took for the balance between Washington and Ottawa to tilt into dangerous uncertainty. The message had come from Donald Trump himself, short, sharp, and unmistakably severe. It was not a casual comment. It was a calculated signal, delivered at a moment when Canada's financial leadership, represented publicly by Mark Carney, had just made remarks about the vulnerability of cross-border trade structures. Carney had spoken carefully, as central bankers always do, using restrained language about stability, systemic risk, and sovereign resilience. Yet in Trump's world, nuance was weakness. Inside the White House briefing room, aides exchanged glances that said everything. This was not a routine political reaction. This was retaliation forming in real time. Trump's response was described by those who saw it first as brutal, not because it carried threats of force, but because it stripped away diplomacy entirely. He questioned Canada's reliability as a partner, accused its leadership of exploiting American goodwill, and implied that long-standing economic understandings were no longer guaranteed. The language was blunt, unforgiving, and designed to be heard not just in Ottawa, but in every boardroom that depended on the U.S. Canada corridor. In Toronto, the reaction was immediate. Senior advisors around Carney were pulled into emergency meetings. They replayed the statement again and again, analyzing tone, timing, and the strategic message hidden beneath the sharp words. The fear was not about today. It was about what tomorrow might bring. Canada's economy is deeply woven into America's. Energy exports, manufacturing supply chains, agricultural agreements, and financial systems are built on trust accumulated over decades. A single aggressive shift from Washington could send shockwaves through markets that had long assumed stability as a given, and this was not an off-the-cuff remark. Trump had chosen his moment precisely. Carney's comments about financial resilience had landed in a tense global environment already strained by inflation, currency volatility, and growing skepticism toward traditional institutions. By responding within minutes, Trump reframed the narrative. What had been a technical discussion suddenly became a confrontation between national power and economic sovereignty. In Ottawa, officials worried less about the words themselves and more about what they signaled. When Trump speaks this way, it is rarely the end of the story. It is the opening chapter. Canada feared that this response was a warning shot, a prelude to pressure tactics that could include tariff threats, regulatory barriers, or public challenges to existing trade frameworks. None of these moves required formal declarations. They only required political will, and Trump had just demonstrated that he was prepared to act decisively. As analysts across both countries tried to piece together the implications, one reality settled in: the relationship that once felt immune to sudden rupture was now exposed. 5 minutes had been enough to transform quiet financial dialogue into a geopolitical standoff, and this was only the beginning. Inside Canada's financial district, the mood shifted from concern to quiet alarm. Executives who normally measured risk in decimals were now forced to interpret political emotion. Trump's response was still echoing across screens, but what unsettled Canadian leadership most was not what he said, it was how fast he said it. Speed, in modern geopolitics, is a weapon. 5 minutes meant no filters, no smoothing of language, no quiet calls between allies. It meant intent. Mark Carney's team moved quickly, but not publicly. There were no fiery counter-statements, no theatrical rebuttals. Instead, the strategy was restraint. When a storm forms across the border, Canada's first instinct is not confrontation, but stabilization. Yet behind closed doors, every scenario was back on the table. trade specialists mapped out which sectors were most exposed if Washington chose to escalate. Automotive manufacturing, with parts crossing the border multiple times before a single vehicle is completed. Energy pipelines whose profitability depends on regulatory harmony. Agriculture, where price fluctuations ripple instantly through rural communities. Each of these systems relied on something that could not be legislated. Trust. Trump's words were interpreted as a fracture in that trust. His framing of Canada as a strategic burden rather than a strategic partner was not new, but the timing was. By responding immediately to Carney, he personalized the tension. It was no longer an abstract disagreement between governments. It was a direct contest between leadership styles, the disciplined caution of a central banker versus the aggressive certainty of a populist president. Within the Canadian cabinet, a difficult realization began to settle. Retaliation might not come in the form of a dramatic announcement. It might arrive quietly, disguised as technical adjustments, administrative delays, or selective enforcement. These are the tools that reshape economies without triggering public panic. The fear was not about losing a single negotiation. It was about entering an era where every financial statement, every policy hint, could provoke a response measured in minutes instead of months. Market watchers in Vancouver and Montreal reported subtle movements that afternoon. Nothing dramatic enough for headlines, but enough to make analysts uneasy. When sentiment shifts, capital moves first, and explanation follows later. Carney himself remained publicly composed, but those close to him knew that the situation cut deeper than routine political turbulence. He had built his career on institutional stability, on the belief that rules outlast personalities. Trump's response challenged that belief directly, and as the Canadian leadership weighed silence against reaction, one haunting question hung in the air: if this was the opening move, how severe would the next one be?
By the next morning, the tension was no longer confined to government buildings. Traders arriving before dawn in New York, Toronto, and Chicago were not focused on earnings reports or economic data. They were replaying Trump's response to Carney, dissecting every phrase, every implication. Political statements are usually background noise in financial markets, but this one had teeth. It threatened the invisible agreements that keep cross-border commerce predictable. What frightened Canada most was uncertainty. Not tariffs, not sanctions, unpredictability. The Canadian dollar began to drift, not sharply, but noticeably enough for currency desks to flag it as sentiment-driven movement. That shift was psychological, not technical. It reflected a growing belief that stability itself was under negotiation. Inside Canada's export-heavy industries, executives convened emergency calls. A factory manager in Ontario spoke of inventory timelines suddenly feeling fragile. An energy firm in Alberta quietly reviewed contract clauses that had not been touched in years. Even tech companies with no direct trade exposure worried about how broader confidence might erode. Trump's response had done something more powerful than policy. It altered expectations. Mark Carney's advisors tried to contain the narrative. They emphasized continuity, reminding partners that Canada's economic foundations were strong, that institutional frameworks had weathered far worse. Yet even as they spoke, they knew credibility now required more than reassurance. It required anticipating a president who thrived on disruption. In Washington, the story took on a different tone. Commentators framed Trump's words as leverage, a negotiating tactic meant to reset the relationship on American terms. But leverage is a double-edged instrument. It compels attention, yet breeds resistance. Canada was not afraid of confrontation in principle. It was afraid of being drawn into a cycle where every measured comment could provoke an immediate counterstrike. That rhythm, action, reaction, escalation, is how long-standing partnerships unravel without either side intending to break them. By midday, the narrative had shifted from "what did Trump say" to "what does Trump do next?" Because once markets begin to price in fear, reversing that process is harder than triggering it, and somewhere between Ottawa's caution and Washington's bravado, the economic bridge connecting two nations started to feel less like a foundation and more like a fault line. The most dangerous phase of any conflict is the quiet one. In the days following Trump's brutal response, there were no dramatic announcements, no official declarations of dispute. Instead, the machinery of government moved in subtle ways that only insiders could see. Canadian trade officials began receiving unusually detailed questions from American counterparts. Nothing overtly hostile, just enough to slow momentum. For Canada, this was the retaliation it feared. Mark Carney's circle recognized the pattern immediately. When power does not shout, it tightens. Processes that once took days began stretching into weeks. Routine approvals were suddenly under review. Every formality became a checkpoint, every checkpoint a message. This was not escalation through confrontation. It was escalation through friction. The Canadian business community felt it first. Companies that had operated for decades under predictable rules now found themselves navigating a fog of administrative ambiguity. Was this coincidence or coordination? No one could say with certainty, and that uncertainty was its own form of leverage. Carney understood the deeper risk. Financial systems are built on rhythm, on the assumption that tomorrow looks broadly like today. Trump's response had disrupted that rhythm. The message was simple: continuity is conditional. In private meetings, Canadian officials debated their next move. Should they mirror the pressure? Should they attempt quiet diplomacy? Or should they wait, trusting that institutional gravity would pull both sides back toward equilibrium? Waiting, however, has a cost. Every day of silence invites speculation, and speculation reshapes reality. Media coverage in both countries hardened. In the United States, commentators framed Canada as resistant to change. In Canada, Trump's posture was seen as a deliberate test of sovereignty. What had begun as a response to a single statement was now evolving into a broader narrative about control, independence, and the limits of partnership. By the end of the week, one truth was undeniable: the retaliation Canada feared was not a single action. It was a condition, a slow, grinding pressure that left no fingerprints yet changed everything, and with no clear signal of where the line lay, every Canadian institution was forced to ask the same unsettling question: how do you defend stability when instability becomes the strategy? Weeks after Trump's brutal response to Carney, the damage could not be measured in headlines or statistics. It lived in hesitation. Canadian ministers found themselves choosing words with surgical care. Corporate leaders delayed investments that once felt routine. Financial planners built models with wider margins for error, not because data demanded it, but because confidence no longer did. The retaliation Canada feared had matured into something more elusive than tariffs or sanctions. It had become an atmosphere. Mark Carney, in private reflection, recognized the historical weight of the moment. Relationships between nations are rarely undone by dramatic collapse. They erode through accumulated doubt. Through every pause before a phone call, every memo that avoids certainty, every policy that anticipates disruption rather than progress. Trump's response had introduced a new rule to the relationship: nothing is permanent. For decades, the U.S.-Canada partnership had been treated as a constant in an unpredictable world. That assumption now felt fragile. Even when discussions resumed, they were layered with suspicion, as though both sides were testing not only policy, but resolve. Yet Canada did not retreat. Instead, its leaders leaned into the very institutions Trump had challenged. They reinforced multilateral relationships, invested in internal resilience, and quietly reminded their allies that sovereignty is not declared, it is practiced. The story did not end with confrontation. It ended with recalibration. A recalibration of power, of trust, of expectations. The brutal response that had arrived 5 minutes after a single statement had reshaped years of assumed stability. And while no formal rupture occurred, everyone understood that the line between partnership and pressure had been crossed, not with noise, but with intent.